She's worthless. Take her take, whatever, just let me walk. That's what he said. 5 years of loyalty reduced to a bargaining chip in a room that smelled of stale gin and desperation. Nora waited for the laughter. She waited for the bullet. Instead, the man they all feared stood up. He didn't look at her ex. He looked at her. Then he dropped 2 heavy canvas bags at Greg's feet. "You're wrong," Julian said, his voice quiet enough to freeze the room. "She's worth exactly 1 million, and you are done." The air inside the warehouse tasted like copper and cheap cigars. It was the kind of thick, unbreathable atmosphere that clung to clothes and seeped into pores, ensuring anyone inside carried the stench of their mistakes home with them, assuming they made it home. Nora stood perfectly still in the corner of the room. Her feet screamed in the 4-inch heels Greg had insisted she wear. It shows respect, he had told her in the cab ride over, his hands already shaking, his eyes darting frantically at passing headlights. "You dress up for these people. You make them think we belong." She didn't belong here. She was a high school art teacher who bought her groceries with coupons. Greg was a mid-level commercial real estate broker whose ambition violently outpaced his competence. And tonight, his ambition had finally hit a brick wall at 100 miles an hour. The green felt of the poker table under the harsh overhead light looked entirely too bright for a room steeped in shadows. Sitting across from Greg were 3 men. 2 were muscle-thick necks, tailored suits that strained at the shoulders, eyes dead and unblinking. The 3rd man sat in the center. Julian. Nora didn't know his last name. Greg had only ever referred to him in hushed, terrified whispers. Julian holds the paper. Julian owns the block. Julian doesn't ask twice. He didn't look like a monster. If a passerby saw him on the street, they might think he was an architect, or maybe a surgeon. He was impeccably clean. His dark hair was brushed back, threading silver at the temples. His suit was charcoal, cut close to a lean, athletic frame. He wasn't drinking the amber liquor the others were. A simple glass of sparkling water, with a twist of lemon, sat by his right hand. He had barely spoken all night. He just watched. Greg's hands were sweating. Nora could see the sheen of it on his knuckles as he pushed his final stack of chips forward. It was a pathetic little pile, a fortress made of sand against an incoming tide. "Call," Greg croaked, his voice cracking. Julian didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He simply turned his cards over. A full house. Aces full of kings. Efficient. Brutal. Final. Greg stared at the cards. His jaw slacked. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a bloated corpse under fluorescent lights. "That's," Greg stammered, pulling at the collar of his shirt. "That's 300,000, total, with the previous markers." 340. One of the thick-necked men corrected. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Interest compounds weekly, Gregory. I don't have it." The admission fell from Greg's lips like a stone. He looked around the room, frantic, his eyes wide and wet. "I need a few days. I have a property closing in Midtown. Commercial zoning. It's huge. It's a guaranteed payout." Julian took a slow sip of his water. He set the glass down precisely on the cardboard coaster. "You don't have a property closing, Greg. You lost your broker's license 3 weeks ago." Nora's breath hitched. She stared at the back of Greg's head. Lost his license. He had left the apartment every morning at 7:30 in a suit. He had complained about clients. He had asked her to cover rent for the 3rd month in a row because his commission was delayed. Greg whipped his head around, finally looking at Nora. The desperation in his eyes morphed into something ugly, something cornered and venomous. "I can give you collateral," Greg said, his voice rising in pitch. He pointed a trembling, sweat-slicked finger at Nora. "Take her. The room went dead silent. Even the ambient hum of the warehouse ventilation seemed to mute itself. Nora felt her heart slam against her ribs. "What? Take her," Greg repeated, standing up now, leaning over the table. "She's pretty. She cleans up nice. You run clubs right. Put her to work. Take her for a month, a year, whatever clears the slate. Just wipe the 340 and we're good." Nora's mind fragmented. 5 years. She had nursed him through pneumonia. She had worked night shifts at a bakery to pay for his initial real estate courses. She had defended him to her friends, her family telling them he was just misunderstood, that he was under a lot of pressure. Now he was tossing her across a poker table to pay a gambling debt. One of the muscle men snorted. "We ain't running a brothel, you pathetic piece of shit. She's a teacher," Greg yelled, entirely losing his grip on reality. "She's smart. She can keep books. She can do whatever you want." "Greg," Nora whispered. Her voice was thin, frail. It disgusted her. She wanted to scream, to flip the table, to claw his eyes out. But her vocal cords felt paralyzed. "Shut up, Nora," Greg snapped, not looking back at her. "I'm trying to save our lives here. You think I want to do this? You don't contribute anything. You draw little pictures and grade finger paintings while I'm out here, trying to build a future." He turned back to Julian, slamming his hands on the table. "Just take her. She's worthless to me anyway. She's worthless." The echo of the word bounced off the concrete walls. Worthless. Julian looked at Greg. Then slowly, his gaze shifted past the sweating man and landed on Nora. His eyes were entirely flat, dark, unreadable, and completely devoid of pity. That was the worst part. Pity she could have fought against. But this was an appraisal. He was looking at her the way a jeweler looks at a stone, checking for fractures, checking for clarity. Nora didn't look away. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her fingernails biting half-moons into her palms. She refused to cry. She would not give Greg the satisfaction, and she would not show weakness to the monster sitting at the table. She lifted her chin, meeting Julian's dead stare. She was not a poker chip, she resolved. She was a human being. Julian held her gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds. Then he stood up. When Julian rose, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't a sudden, violent movement. It was the smooth, fluid motion of a predator, deciding the hunt was over. He buttoned the center button of his jacket. Greg took a step back, tripping slightly over the leg of his chair. I just need—" "Quiet," Julian said. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice even a fraction. But the command sliced through Greg's babbling like a straight razor. Greg snapped his mouth shut, his chest heaving. Julian stepped out from behind the table. He walked with a measured, deliberate pace, entirely bypassing Greg. He walked straight toward the corner where Nora stood, pinned by the shadows. Nora held her ground. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to bolt for the heavy steel door at the end of the warehouse, but her legs were lead. She watched his polished Oxfords eat up the distance between them. He stopped 2 feet away. Up close, he smelled of expensive dry cleaning and faint cold rain. There was a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Nora," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was a small victory, but she clung to it. Nora. He tested the name on his tongue. It wasn't a compliment, nor an insult. Just data. "Are you aware of the debt this man has accrued?" "No," she said flatly. "I thought he sold office spaces." Julian's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile, just a brief disturbance in the granite of his face. "He sells nothing but lies, Nora. To you, mostly." He turned his back on her, facing Greg. Greg was visibly shaking now, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air as if preparing to catch a blow. You evaluate poorly, Gregory, Julian said softly. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, singular crack that echoed loudly. From the dark periphery of the room, a fourth man stepped forward. He was carrying two large, dark green canvas duffel bags. They looked heavy. The man walked past the table and dropped them directly at Greg's feet. Thud. Thud. The sound was dense, substantial. Dust puffed up from the concrete floor around the bags. Greg looked down at them, bewildered. What is this? Julian reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a slim silver lighter. He didn't light a cigarette. He just turned the metal over in his hands, watching the fluorescent light catch its edges. You called her worthless, Julian stated. You offered her to me to clear a $340,000 debt. Yes, Greg said, eagerly nodding fast. Yes, exactly. A straight trade. No, Julian replied. It is not a straight trade, because you possess the economic foresight of a desperate junkie. Julian gestured to the bags with the lighter. Unzip them. Greg scrambled to his knees. He grabbed the heavy brass zipper of the first bag and yanked it open. Nora gasped. She couldn't help it. Banded stacks of $100 bills, row after row, neatly packed, smelling faintly of ink and dirty hands. It was more money than Nora had ever seen in her entire life. It was movie money, unattainable, terrifying wealth, just sitting in a dirty duffel bag on a warehouse floor. There is exactly $1 million in those bags, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated in Nora's chest. Minus the $340 you owe me. The remaining $660,000 is yours to keep. Greg stayed on his knees, his hands hovering over the cash, afraid to touch it. He looked up at Julian, entirely uncomprehending. Mine, why? Because I am buying her, Julian said. The words hit Nora like a physical blow. The air rushed out of her lungs. Buying. Like a car. Like a painting. Greg let out a breathless, manic laugh. You're paying me for her $1 million. He looked at Nora, a sickening grin stretching across his face. I told you, Nora. I told you we'd get out of this. He looked back at Julian. Deal. Take her. She's yours. Julian stepped forward. The heel of his shoe came down hard on Greg's fingers. Greg screamed a high, reedy sound of pure agony, but Julian didn't lift his foot. He pressed down, leaning into it, his face remaining entirely expressionless. I am not giving you this money because she is for sale, Julian said, quietly looking down at the writhing man. I am giving you this money to establish a baseline of reality. You called her worthless. I am proving, empirically, that you are a blind, stupid man. I am paying $1 million to watch you realize that the most valuable thing in your pathetic life was standing right behind you, and you threw it away. Julian slowly removed his foot. Greg curled into a ball, cradling his hand, sobbing. Julian looked at one of his men. Count the 340. Leave him the rest, then break his other hand. If he is seen in this city again, kill him. He turned back to Nora. She was trembling now. The sheer, calculated violence of the man was suffocating. He didn't reach out to touch her. He didn't offer his hand. He simply looked at her and said, We are leaving. Nora didn't look back at Greg. As she walked toward the heavy steel door, the sound of a bone snapping echoed behind her, followed by a muffled, agonizing shriek. She didn't flinch. To her own surprise, she felt absolutely nothing for the man bleeding on the floor. 5 years of love had evaporated in the span of 5 minutes, burned away by betrayal and the harsh glare of a warehouse light. She pushed through the door, stepping out into the biting chill of the November night. The cold air hit her lungs like shards of glass, snapping her back to reality. A black SUV idled by the curb, its exhaust pluming white in the dark. Julian was already standing by the open rear door. He wasn't holding it for her out of chivalry. He was waiting for his cargo to load. Nora stopped on the sidewalk. She crossed her arms over her thin dress, shivering violently. "I'm not going with you." Julian paused. He rested his hand on the top edge of the car door. "You have $43 in your checking account, Nora. Your lease is in his name. And the men inside this warehouse will not distinguish between Gregory and Gregory's girlfriend if they decide 600,000 isn't enough to soothe their pride." She stared at him. "You looked into my bank account. I hold a debt for a man. I look into everything that man touches," Julian said evenly. "Get in the car. You bought me." She spat the disgust, finally breaking through her shock. "You dropped $1 million on the floor like I was a piece of meat at an auction." "I dropped $1 million to break a man's spirit," Julian corrected her, his tone maddeningly calm. "You were the instrument of that breaking. Do not mistake a tactical display of wealth for human trafficking. I don't buy people, Nora. They are a terrible return on investment." He tapped the roof of the car. "Get in, or walk back to Brooklyn in those ridiculous shoes. I frankly do not care which you choose." He slid into the back seat, leaving the door open. Nora looked down the desolate street. It was industrial, empty, and dark. She looked back at the open door. The interior of the SUV was bathed in warm amber light. She made a choice. Not a good choice, but the only one that didn't involve freezing to death or getting murdered by mobsters. She climbed in. The door shut with a heavy, pressurized thunk that isolated them from the noise of the city. The leather seats were heated. It smelled of worn leather and the faint citrus of Julian's cologne. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Nora kept herself pressed tight against the opposite window. The silence stretched thick and heavy. She watched the streetlights flicker across Julian's face. He was reading something on his phone, entirely unbothered by her presence. "So what happens now?" Nora finally asked, her voice tight. "If I'm not a slave, and I'm not a prostitute, what am I, a pet?" Julian didn't look up from his screen. "You are a liability that I just spent $1 million to acquire, which makes you my problem. I didn't ask to be acquired, and I didn't ask to witness a grown man try to pawn his loyal partner off to save his kneecaps, yet here we are," Julian replied, finally locking his phone and sliding it into his pocket. He turned his head to look at her. In the dim light of the car, his eyes seemed darker, almost black. "You gave up 5 years of your life for a parasite," Julian said softly. It wasn't an insult. It was an autopsy of her past. "You worked double shifts. You paid his debts. You let him convince you that your own dreams, your art, your career were secondary to his hustle." Nora's breath caught. "How do you know about my art?" "I told you. I know everything he touches." Julian shifted slightly, leaning forward. "Gregory looked at you and saw a shield. Something to throw in front of the bullets meant for him. He saw you as worthless because he is fundamentally incapable of recognizing value." "And what do you see?" Nora asked, her voice barely a whisper. She hated how desperate she sounded, hated that she was asking a Mafia boss for validation, but the ground had vanished beneath her feet, and she was free falling. Julian stared at her. For the first time all night, the cold, calculating mask slipped just a fraction. There was something intensely heavy behind his gaze. Something that looked remarkably like anger, though not directed at her. "I see someone who doesn't know how to fight for herself yet," Julian said. "I see loyalty wasted on a fool." He looked away, staring out the front windshield into the dark traffic. "I don't abide waste, Nora. Tomorrow we fix your life. Tonight you sleep." He reached into the console between them, pulled out a thick wool blanket, and tossed it into her lap. Nora caught it. It was heavy warm. She pulled it around her shoulders, realizing for the first time how exhausted she truly was. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving her hollowed out and aching. She looked at the man beside her. Feared. Ruthless. He had just broken a man's bones and dropped a fortune on a dirty floor. He was a monster by every definition of the word, but as Nora closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engine lull her into the dark, she realized something terrifying. For the first time in 5 years, she felt safe. Waking up was a slow, brutal process of inventory. First came the physical. Nora's head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. Her feet were swollen, the blisters from Greg's mandated heels stinging against the sheets. Then came the environmental. The sheets were heavy, cool, and smelled of unscented detergent. The mattress was firm. There was no traffic noise, no rattling radiator. Finally the memory. The poker table, the duffel bags, the sound of Greg's hand splintering under a leather shoe. Nora sat up, dragging the heavy duvet to her chin. She was in a bedroom that looked less like a home and more like a high-end hotel suite waiting for its next anonymous guest. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, grey and bruised under the early morning clouds. The walls were slate, the furniture minimalist and sharp. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter. It was a room devoid of history. A polite double knock at the door made her flinch. "Come in," she said. Her voice felt like sandpaper. The door opened, and a woman in her late 50s stepped inside. She wore a simple grey dress and carried a tray. She had kind eyes, but her posture was strictly professional. "Good morning, miss," the woman said, setting the tray on the glass nightstand. "Coffee black, a carafe of water. 2 aspirin. My name is Helen. Mr. Russo requested I check on you. He is waiting in the dining room when you are ready." Russo. Julian Russo. The name finally anchored the ghost to reality. "Where are we?" Nora asked. "Tribeca," Helen replied smoothly. She opened a closet door to reveal a row of brand-new clothing. Sweaters, jeans, simple blouses. The tags were still on. "I took the liberty of guessing your sizes based on what you arrived in. There are toiletries in the bathroom. Take your time." Helen left quietly, the door clicking shut behind her. Nora stared at the coffee. She didn't want to drink it. She didn't want to wear his clothes. She wanted to wake up in her cramped, drafty Brooklyn apartment. But that apartment was gone, tethered to a man who had sold her for a fraction of what he owed. She took the aspirin. She drank the coffee. She showered in a bathroom made of seamless black marble, scrubbing her skin until it turned pink, trying to wash off the scent of the warehouse, the memory of Greg's sweat. She dressed in a pair of dark jeans and a grey cashmere sweater that cost more than her monthly rent. It fit perfectly. That unsettled her more than if it hadn't. When Nora finally navigated the sprawling, silent penthouse to the dining room, she found Julian. He was sitting at a massive oak table reading a tablet. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faint, jagged scars. The suit jacket was gone, but the aura of suppressed violence remained. He didn't look up as she entered. "Sit." Nora pulled out a chair at the opposite end of the table. "You bought me a wardrobe." "I provided basic necessities," Julian corrected, scrolling through a document on his screen. "Your previous clothing was compromised by the environment of the warehouse, and frankly it looked cheap. If you are going to reside here, you will not look like a victim." "I am a victim." Nora snapped, the anger finally burning through the fog of her exhaustion. "You abducted me." Julian locked the tablet and set it face down. He looked at her. The flat, dead eyes from the night before were gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. "You got into my car," he said calmly. "You could have walked. You evaluated the risks and made a choice. That makes you a survivor, Nora. Stop clinging to the victim narrative. It serves no tactical purpose." He slid a manila folder down the length of the long table. It stopped precisely in front of her. "Open it." Nora hesitated, then flipped the cover. Inside was a new driver's license, a passport, and a sleek black credit card. The names matched hers, but the address was the penthouse. "Your old life is currently being dismantled by my associates," Julian explained, picking up his coffee. "Your lease is broken. Your belongings, the ones worth keeping, will be placed in storage. The school where you teach has received a formal letter of resignation, citing a family emergency." Nora shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "You quit my job. You have no right. That was mine. That was the only thing I had that Greg didn't ruin." Julian didn't flinch at her outburst. He took a sip of his coffee. "Your school is a public building with no security. Greg owes money to people who are far less disciplined than I am. When he eventually resurfaces, and he will because rats always seek food, he will look for you. He will bring his mess to your classroom. Do you want to expose children to that?" Nora froze. The fire in her chest turned to ice. She pictured her third graders. She pictured the men from the warehouse walking into the art room. She slowly sat back down. She hated that he was right. She hated the cold, undeniable logic of his world. "So I'm a prisoner," she said quietly. "You are a guest," Julian said. "You have a card with a $50,000 limit. You can leave this apartment whenever you wish, provided you take Thomas with you." He gestured toward the hallway, where a massive, suited man stood silently by the elevator bank. "You will not contact your old friends. You will not look for Gregory. You will use this time to figure out what your life is actually worth, now that you aren't spending it carrying a dead weight." "And what do you get out of this?" Nora asked, narrowing her eyes. "Men like you don't do charity." Julian looked at her for a long time. The silence stretched until it felt fragile, ready to snap. "I despise watching potential decay," Julian said, his voice dropping a fraction. "And I owed myself a reminder that not everything in this city has a price tag. You are my reminder, Nora. Do not disappoint me by being useless." He picked up his tablet and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with a new identity and a sprawling, empty cage. 3 weeks passed. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room in purgatory. Nora spent the first week sleeping, her body finally relieved of the chronic low-grade terror of keeping Greg afloat completely shut down. By the second week, the silence began to deafen her. She paced the perimeter of the apartment. She watched the city move hundreds of feet below, a living, breathing organism that she was no longer a part of. Thomas, her shadow, was polite, but entirely uncommunicative. Helen brought food. Julian was a ghost. He left before she woke and returned long after she retreated to her room. When they did cross paths, it was a brief knot, a transactional exchange of oxygen in the hallway. By the third week, Nora was losing her mind. She found him in his home office, late on a Tuesday night. The door was ajar. The room smelled of old paper leather and black coffee. Julian was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of heavily redacted ledgers and shipping manifests. He was rubbing the bridge of his nose, looking visibly exhausted. Nora knocked on the open door frame. He didn't look up. "If you need something, tell Helen." "I don't need anything," Nora said, stepping into the room. "I want a job." Julian stopped writing. He slowly raised his head. "Excuse me." "I'm going insane," Nora said, crossing her arms. She stood her ground under his heavy gaze. I am not a house cat. I can't sit around spending your money on clothes I have nowhere to wear. I want to work. You are currently hiding from 3 different syndicates who would love to use you as leverage against me, Julian said flatly. You aren't working. I meant here, she countered. She pointed at the towering stacks of paper on his desk. I managed the logistics for a school art department on a budget of $0. I managed Greg's chaotic, fraudulent finances for 5 years. I know how to find patterns. Let me help. Julian leaned back in his chair. He studied her. It was that same appraising look from the warehouse, but this time it lacked the cruelty. It was a genuine calculation. This isn't grading finger paintings, Nora. I know, she said. It's money laundering, or smuggling, or whatever it is you do to afford an apartment that costs more than the GDP of a small island. A sharp, barking laugh escaped Julian's lips. It was a shocking sound, rough-rusted from disuse. It transformed his face, making him look younger, entirely human for a split second. It's a restaurant supply company, Julian said, the ghost of a smile still hovering around his mouth. Legitimate, mostly. It provides the cover for the less savory operations. But the margins are bleeding, and my accountant is either incompetent or stealing from me. He slid a heavy leather-bound ledger across the desk. You want a job, find the leak. You have 48 hours. If you fail, you go back to watching daytime television. Nora walked forward, her heart beating a fast, steady rhythm against her ribs. She picked up the ledger. It was heavy. And if I find it... Then we will discuss a salary, Julian said, turning back to his own paperwork. You will be paid exactly what you are worth. Not a penny more. For the next 2 days, Nora barely slept. She set up camp at the far end of the dining table. She requested highlighters, a calculator, and a whiteboard from Helen. She dove into the numbers. It was a mess. The supply company was bloated with phantom vendors, duplicate invoices, and erratic fuel surcharges. But numbers didn't lie. They didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They didn't gamble away their future in dirty warehouses. Numbers followed rules. On Thursday night at 11 p.m., Nora walked back into Julian's office. She dropped the ledger on his desk. Julian looked up. Page 42. Nora said, her voice raspy but firm. Vendor payouts to a company called Apex Logistics. They invoice you for refrigerated transport every week. But look at the fuel receipts. Julian opened the book. He traced his finger down the column she had highlighted in bright yellow. The fuel usage doesn't match the mileage for refrigerated trucks, Nora explained, leaning over the desk. She was close enough to smell his cologne again, that cold rain and citrus. They're billing you for heavy freighters, but the gas receipts suggest they're running standard box trucks. The temperature logs are falsified. They aren't hauling perishable goods. They're hauling dry goods and pocketing the difference in transport rates. It's roughly $80,000 a month. Julian stared at the numbers. He was silent for a long time. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, dangerous electricity. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely cold. "Thomas!" Julian called out. The giant man appeared in the doorway instantly. "Get a car ready," Julian said softly. "We need to visit the owner of Apex Logistics." Thomas nodded and vanished. Julian closed the ledger. He finally looked up at Nora. She stood there, suddenly aware of what she had just set in motion. She had found a thief. In her world, a person fired a thief. In Julian's world, they destroyed them. Nora hesitated, taking a step back. "What are you going to do to him?" Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "I am going to close an unprofitable account. That is the reality of the work you asked to do, Nora. Every number has a consequence. Every error bleeds." He walked past her, stopping just as he reached the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "Your logic is flawless," Julian said quietly. "Your attention to detail is sharp. I will have a contract drafted tomorrow. 50,000 a year to start. Welcome to the firm." He walked down the hall. Nora stood alone in the office, the heavy ledger resting on the desk. She had wanted to feel useful. She had wanted to take control of her life. Now she had a job working for a monster. And heaven help her, she was good at it. Winter settled over New York like a heavy iron blanket. 2 months into her employment, Nora's life had settled into a bizarre, high-stakes routine. She worked out of the penthouse, auditing the legitimate fronts of Julian's empire. She found inefficiencies, trimmed waste, and structured payrolls. She was essentially the shadow CFO of a criminal organization. The fear had dulled, replaced by a strange, hyper-focused adrenaline. Julian was no longer a ghost. They spent hours together in his office, arguing over tax structures and shell corporations. He was ruthless, demanding, and entirely uncompromising. But he listened to her. When she spoke, he didn't interrupt. He didn't belittle her. For a man who ruled through intimidation, he treated her mind with absolute reverence. It was intoxicating. But the cage, however gilded, was still a cage. "I need to go out," Nora announced one Tuesday morning. Julian was drinking espresso at the dining table, reading the physical newspaper. He didn't lower the paper. "Thomas is available to drive you." "I don't just want to drive. I need to walk," Nora said, pulling on a heavy wool coat. "I need art supplies, real ones. I'm going to a store in Soho. It's a Tuesday morning. It will be empty." Julian slowly lowered the paper. He looked at her, his eyes tracking over the determination in her posture. "Take Garrett as well," Julian said smoothly. Garrett was new to the detail, younger, faster, with eyes that constantly scanned the perimeter like a nervous hawk. "Fine," Nora agreed. The air outside was brutally cold, biting at her cheeks the moment she stepped out of the SUV. Soho was relatively quiet, the cobblestone streets slick with melting frost. Walking into the art supply store felt like stepping into a past life. The smell of linseed oil, raw canvas, and graphite hit her like a physical blow. She closed her eyes for a second, just breathing it in. She spent an hour wandering the aisles, picking up heavy-body acrylics, a set of sable brushes, and 3 large primed canvases. For the first time in months, her fingers itched to create something that wasn't a spreadsheet. Garrett stood by the front door, looking entirely out of place among the display of watercolor papers, his hands resting casually inside the pockets of his dark coat. Nora approached the register, pulling out the black metal card Julian had given her. "Well, well, well. Look who moved up in the world." The voice made the blood freeze in Nora's veins. It was a greasy, familiar sound. She turned slowly. Standing near the display of easels was a man named Ricky. He was one of Greg's old associates, a low-level bottom feeder who ran illegal dice games in basement apartments. He looked worse than she remembered: straggly hair, a dirty puffer jacket, and eyes that were manic and darting. "Ricky," Nora said, her voice tight. "Greg's been looking for you, sweetheart." Ricky sneered, stepping closer. He smelled like stale beer and unwashed clothes. "He's in a bad way. Lost the use of his right hand. Funny that. He said you ran off with the heavy hitters." Ricky's eyes dropped to the black card in her hand. A greedy, ugly light sparked in his pupils. "Looks like he was right. You holding out on us? Nora, Greg owes a lot of people. You think you can just walk away while we starve?" He reached out his dirty fingers, grabbing her wrist. He didn't even get to squeeze. A blur of motion eclipsed Nora's vision. Garrett crossed 15 feet of retail space in a fraction of a second. He didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. Garrett grabbed Ricky by the throat with his left hand, lifting the man to his toes, and slammed him backward into the easel display. Wood splintered with a loud, violent crash. Canvases tumbled to the floor. The cashier screamed. "Do not touch her," Garrett said. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, a chilling echo of Julian's demeanor. Ricky gagged his hands, clawing uselessly at Garrett's wrist. His face turned an ugly shade of purple. "Garrett, stop!" Nora yelled, stepping forward. "You're going to kill him!" Garrett didn't release the pressure. He looked at Nora, waiting for a direct order. "Let him go," Nora demanded, her voice shaking. Garrett released his grip. Ricky collapsed to the floor among the broken wood, coughing, violently gasping for air. Garrett stepped over the wheezing man, retrieved Nora's bags from the counter, and dropped a stack of $100 bills on the register. "For the damages," he told the terrified cashier. He placed a hand lightly on Nora's back. "We are leaving. Now." The ride back to the penthouse was a suffocating blur. Nora stared out the window, her hands trembling violently in her lap. She wasn't just an accountant. She wasn't just a guest. The violence wasn't theoretical. It was walking right beside her, ready to break a man's neck in an art store. When they entered the penthouse, Julian was standing in the foyer. He had clearly already received a call. His face was an unreadable mask of cold fury, the kind of anger that didn't yell but burned everything it touched to ash. "Garrett, wait outside," Julian ordered softly. The door clicked shut. Nora stood in the entryway, the bags of art supplies heavy in her hands. Julian closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. He loomed over her, vibrating with a tightly coiled tension. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a harsh whisper. "No," Nora said. She looked up at him, refusing to shrink. "Garrett handled it." "You shouldn't have been there," Julian said, his jaw flexing. "You are not a civilian, Nora. You cannot wander the streets pretending the past is dead. The past doesn't die. It waits." "I was buying paint," Nora shouted, the adrenaline finally breaking into tears she refused to shed. She dropped the bags to the floor. "I wanted 1 normal hour. I am trying to build something out of the wreckage, Julian. I am doing your books. I am living in your fortress. But I am not yours to lock away." "You are mine!" Julian roared. The sound shattered the immaculate silence of the penthouse. It wasn't the roar of a mob boss claiming property. It was the raw, desperate sound of a man terrified of losing something. Nora froze. The echo of the words hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Julian stopped breathing. He realized what he had said. The cold, impenetrable armor cracked, fracturing down the center. He took a step back, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining it. "You are my responsibility," he corrected his voice, dropping to a gravelly, defeated low. He looked away from her, staring at the floor. "When I was 22, I let someone walk out of a safe house because they wanted to feel normal for an hour. They wanted to buy a book." He looked back at her. The dead eyes were gone. In their place was a hollow, consuming grief. "They were mailed back to me in pieces," Julian said quietly. "I do not abide waste, Nora. I do not abide losing what I have decided to protect. You want to paint? Paint. Here. I will buy you the entire damn store. But do not ask me to gamble with your life so you can feel normal." He turned and walked away, disappearing down the long hallway toward his office. Nora stood in the foyer, staring at the empty space he left behind. The bags of paint rested by her feet. The cage hadn't been built to keep her in. It was built to keep the monsters out. And the man who built it was the most terrified of them all. The penthouse began to smell like turpentine and raw ambition. Nora claimed the northeast corner of the living room. She pushed a $6,000 leather armchair out of the way to make room for her easel. For the first few days, she simply stared at the blank canvas. The white space was terrifying. It demanded a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to articulate. Then, on a Friday night, while the city roared silently outside the thick glass, she picked up a palette knife. She didn't paint flowers. She didn't paint landscapes. She painted the suffocating grip of a warehouse. She painted jagged, violent strokes of charcoal and crimson. She painted the heavy, suffocating weight of $1 million crashing against concrete. Julian didn't stop her. He didn't complain about the stray drop of cerulean blue that permanently stained the imported rug. He would sit on the sofa, a glass of mineral water in his hand, and watch her work. He never offered critiques. He just observed, treating her creative process with the same quiet intensity he applied to his ledgers. "Who was it?" Nora asked one evening. She didn't look away from the canvas, dragging a thick layer of titanium white across the rough fabric. The silence stretched so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. "My younger brother," Julian finally said. The words sounded like they were dragged over broken glass. "Leo." Nora stopped moving. She lowered the palette knife. "He was 19. Julian continued staring at the floor between his shoes. He hated the life. He hated the noise, the paranoia. He wanted to study architecture. I told him he could, but he had to stay close. He had to keep the detail with him. Julian set his glass down. The ice clinked sharply. One afternoon, he bribed his security detail to look the other way. He just wanted to go to a bookstore in the village by himself. He wanted to sit in a cafe and read without two armed men breathing down his neck. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The family we were at war with didn't care that he was a civilian. They only cared that he shared my blood. It was a message. Nora turned to face him. The cold, impenetrable Mafia boss was gone. In his place sat a man hollowed out by a decade of survivor's guilt. "I bought you from a man who treated you like garbage," Julian said, looking up at her. His eyes were entirely defenseless. "I told myself it was to prove a point to Gregory, a tactical display, but that was a lie." He stood up, walking slowly toward her easel. He stopped just inches away, close enough that Nora could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I saw someone drowning for the sake of a man who didn't care," Julian whispered, "and I couldn't watch it happen again. I locked you in this tower because I thought I could control the variables. I thought if I just built the walls thick enough, the world couldn't get in." Nora reached out. Her fingers were stained with black paint. She didn't care. She pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. It was beating in a steady, heavy rhythm. "You can't control the variables, Julian," she said softly. "You can only choose who you stand in the crossfire with." He looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes. The space between them evaporated. He didn't kiss her gently. There was no hesitation, no polite inquiry. He kissed her like a man dying of thirst. His hands came up to grip her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. The kiss was desperate bruising and tasted of bitter espresso and suppressed ruin. Nora kissed him back with equal ferocity. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. 5 years she had spent, shrinking, making herself small to accommodate Greg's fragile ego. Julian didn't want her small. He wanted all of her, the anger, the intelligence, the mess. When they finally broke apart, the air in the room felt altered. Julian rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "I am a bad man, Nora. I do terrible things to keep this empire standing. "I know," she whispered, her hands still clutching his shirt. "But you're the only honest monster I've ever met." The moment shattered with the sharp, shrill ring of Julian's encrypted cell phone. He stiffened. He didn't want to answer it, but the phone kept ringing, a persistent, ugly sound that dragged them back to reality. He pulled away, reaching into his pocket. "Russo," he answered. Nora watched his face. The vulnerability vanished instantly, replaced by the granite mask. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Where?" Julian asked sharply. "How many?" He listened for another 10 seconds. He hung up the phone without another word. "What is it?" Nora asked, her heart kick-starting in her chest. "That was Thomas," Julian said, walking swiftly toward the hallway. "Greg is back in the city." Nora's blood ran cold. "You broke his hand. You told him you'd kill him." "I did," Julian said, pulling a heavy steel lockbox from beneath the console table in the hall. He keyed in a code and it popped open. Inside was a matte black handgun and 2 spare magazines. But desperation makes men stupid. He didn't come alone. He went to the Barone family, the syndicate that runs the docks. He sold them the routes you've been auditing. Nora felt the breath leave her lungs. The logistics routes. The lifeblood of Julian's legitimate and illegitimate cash flow. How could he possibly know the routes? She demanded. Julian checked the slide of the weapon, racking around into the chamber with a sharp clack. He didn't. But he knew you were the one auditing them. He told the Barones that my new accountant is the weak link. They're hitting the primary warehouse in Queens tonight. The warehouse with the server, Nora asked, stepping forward. Julian, the entire backup ledger is on that local server. If they take that, they have every piece of leverage they need to dismantle you. I am aware, Julian said. He shoved the spare magazines into his coat pocket. Garrett and Thomas are meeting me downstairs. We are going to wipe the server and burn the building before the Barones arrive. I'm coming with you, Nora said. Absolutely not. Julian, the server is encrypted with a rolling cipher. Nora argued, her voice rising. She grabbed her coat from the rack. You don't have the key. I do. If you try to brute force it, the failsafe will lock the drive and broadcast the data to the cloud. You need me to wipe it clean. Julian turned on her, his eyes flashing with raw fury. I am not taking you into a war zone. You just said it yourself, Nora yelled, stepping right into his space, refusing to back down. You can't control the variables. This is my work, Julian. It's my ledger. Let me fix this. He stared at her. The ticking clock in his head was practically audible. Every second they wasted arguing was a second the Baroness gained on the warehouse. He swore violently in Italian. If you leave my sight for a single second, I will lock you in a vault for the rest of your life. Do you understand me? Drive, Nora said. The drive to Queens was a blur of neon lights and heavy silence. The SUV tore through the midnight streets, running red lights with impunity. Garrett drove his eyes fixed on the road, while Thomas sat in the passenger seat, a suppressed automatic rifle resting across his knees. Julian sat in the back with Nora. He held her hand. His grip was tight, almost painful, grounding them both in the escalating chaos. The warehouse sat on the edge of the East River. It wasn't the dirty, abandoned husk where Nora had been sold. This was a massive modern logistics hub. Rows of shipping containers stacked 3 high formed a labyrinth of rusted corrugated steel. Garrett killed the headlights as they approached the perimeter. He coasted the heavy SUV through an open chain-link gate, parking it deep in the shadow of a stacked container block. Perimeter looks clear, boss, Thomas muttered, scanning the dark yard through night vision optics. But the gate was cut. Somebody is already inside. Move fast. Stay quiet, Julian ordered. He looked at Nora. You stay behind me, always. They slipped out of the vehicle into the freezing river wind. The air smelled of brine, diesel fuel, and damp concrete. The server room was located in the central office module, a reinforced steel box elevated on concrete pillars in the middle of the warehouse floor. They navigated the aisles of towering shelving units, their footsteps silent on the concrete. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a spreadsheet. This wasn't an abstract column of numbers. This was the bleeding edge of the world she had chosen. They reached the metal stairs leading to the office. Julian took point, his weapon raised, slicing the pie around the corner of the doorframe. He nodded. Clear. They rushed inside. The room was bathed in the cool blue light of server racks. "Do it," Julian told Nora. "Wipe it all." Nora threw herself into the rolling office chair, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. She brought up the command terminal. The rolling cipher demanded a 12-step authentication process that she had designed herself. 3 minutes, she said, her eyes locked on the screen. "We don't have 3 minutes," Garrett said from the doorway. A sharp, deafening crack shattered the silence. The glass window of the office exploded inward. Nora screamed, ducking under the desk as shards of glass rained down on her. "Contact!" Thomas roared, raising his rifle. He fired a 3-round burst into the dark expanse of the warehouse. The return fire was overwhelming. Sparks flew as bullets chewed into the server racks and shredded the drywall. The noise was apocalyptic, a physical force that punched the air out of the room. Julian grabbed Nora by the collar of her coat, dragging her away from the desk and pressing her flat against the reinforced steel wall beneath the window frame. He covered her body with his own. "Keep typing!" Julian yelled over the roar of gunfire. Nora reached up blindly, her hand finding the keyboard on the desk above her. She couldn't see the screen. She had to do it from memory. Enter. Tab. Access code. Execute. "Got him!" Thomas shouted, dropping a man on the catwalk opposite their position. But 2 more replaced him. "They're flanking the stairs," Garrett warned, firing steady, controlled shots out the door. Amidst the chaos, a voice echoed through the warehouse. It was amplified by a megaphone, but the reedy, desperate pitch was unmistakable. "Nora, I know you're up there." "Greg." Nora froze her finger, hovering over the final enter key. "I tried to tell them you were just a stupid teacher," Greg's voice echoed, cracking with manic panic. "But they wanted the books. Just give them the drives." "Nora, they said they'd let me go if I bring them the drives." Disgust, cold and absolute, washed over her. He hadn't changed. He was still trying to use her as a shield to save his own miserable life. "Wipe it," Julian commanded, firing twice over the window ledge. Nora slammed the enter key. The blue lights on the server racks flashed red, then simultaneously went entirely dark. The fans whirred to a stop. The data was gone, bleached into nothing. "It's done," Nora yelled. "We move!" Julian grabbed her hand, hauling her to her feet. They couldn't go down the stairs. The Barone muscle had it choked off. "The freight window!" Julian shouted to Garrett. At the back of the office was a heavy industrial loading door, meant for moving large equipment via forklift. Garrett kicked the release latch, shoving the heavy metal door up. It opened out into a 15-foot drop onto a stack of wooden pallets. "Go!" Julian pushed Nora toward the ledge. She didn't hesitate. She jumped, landing hard on the wood, the impact jarring her spine. Garrett landed next to her a second later, pulling her behind the cover of a forklift. Thomas jumped next, but as he hit the ground, a burst of gunfire from the catwalk caught him in the shoulder. He grunted, stumbling forward, dropping his rifle. "Thomas!" Julian roared from the office ledge. Julian didn't jump. He turned back, laying down rapid suppressive fire to cover Thomas's retreat. Nora watched in horror from the floor. "Julian, jump!" she screamed. A shadow emerged from the stairwell behind Julian. It was Greg. He was holding a cheap revolver in his left hand, his right hand still bound in a thick, dirty cast. He was shaking violently. "I just need the drives," Greg screamed, pointing the gun blindly at Julian's back. "Julian, behind you!" Nora shrieked. Julian spun, but Greg pulled the trigger in a spasm of pure terror. The shot was wild. It didn't hit center mass. It caught Julian high in the ribs, just under his arm. Julian stumbled backward, dropping his gun. He grabbed his side blood, instantly blooming through his coat. But he didn't fall. He looked at Greg. The look wasn't angry. It was the look of a god assessing an insect. Greg looked at the gun in his hand, horrified by what he had actually done. He backed up, tripping over a desk chair. Julian stepped forward, ignoring the blood pouring from his side. He didn't pick up his gun. He grabbed Greg by the throat with one hand, lifting him completely off his feet. "You evaluate poorly, Gregory," Julian whispered. With a brutal heave, Julian threw Greg backward. Greg crashed through the shattered window, plummeting 15 feet down to the concrete floor below. He hit the ground with a sickening, wet crunch. He didn't move. Julian swayed on the ledge, his strength finally failing. He pitched forward. "Catch him!" Nora screamed. Garrett lunged, catching Julian before his head hit the pallets. Together, Nora and Garrett dragged the bleeding boss behind the forklift. "The sirens!" Thomas gasped from the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. In the distance, the wail of police cruisers cut through the night air. The Barone muscle heard it too. Without the element of surprise, and with the servers dark, the hitmen cut their losses. The sound of fleeing footsteps echoed toward the back exits. Nora dropped to her knees beside Julian. His face was chalk white. Blood was pooling beneath him, staining the wood. She tore off her scarf, balling it up, and pressing it brutally hard against the gunshot wound. Julian gasped in pain, his eyes rolling back. "Stay with me!" Nora screamed, her hands slick with his blood. "You don't get to die. You bought this mess. You don't get to leave me with it. Open your eyes." Julian forced his eyes open. He looked up at her, a weak, bloody smile touching the corner of his lips. "Bossy," he wheezed. "Garrett, get the car," Nora ordered, entirely taking command. "Thomas, wrap your shoulder. We are leaving right now." She looked down at the man bleeding into her hands. The feared Mafia boss. The monster. Her monster. "I've got you," she whispered, leaning down until her forehead touched his. "I've got you." The private clinic was located in a soundproofed basement beneath a veterinary hospital in Brooklyn. It smelled of bleach and iodine. Nora sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting area. She had been there for 6 hours. Her hands were still stained with dried blood and titanium white paint. She hadn't washed them. She needed the physical reminder that it was real. The heavy door down the hall opened, and an older doctor in scrubs walked out, pulling off his surgical mask. Nora stood up immediately. "He'll live," the doctor said tiredly. "Bullet cracked a rib, missed the lung by a fraction of an inch. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stubborn. He's awake." Nora pushed past the doctor, practically running down the hall. Julian was lying in a sterile, bright room. He was hooked up to an IV and a heart monitor that beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. His chest was heavily bandaged, his torso bare. He looked pale, exhausted, and incredibly human. He turned his head as she entered. The flat, dead eyes were gone permanently. When he looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. Nora walked over and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. She didn't say anything. She just reached out and took his hand. His grip was weak, but he laced his fingers through hers immediately. "The server?" Julian asked, his voice a raspy whisper. "Wiped clean," Nora said. "The police found the warehouse. They found a few bodies. They found Greg. Julian's jaw tightened. Is he dead? Broken spine, Nora said coldly. She felt no pity. She felt nothing for the man on the warehouse floor. He's paralyzed. He's currently under police guard at Bellevue. He's going to spend the rest of his life in a prison hospital. Good, Julian breathed out. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the monitor. You didn't run, Julian said, studying her face. When the shooting started, you had a clear path out the loading dock. You could have vanished into the city. You had my credit card. You could have started over. I did start over, Nora said. She squeezed his hand. My life is in the penthouse, surrounded by ledgers and ruined rugs. I am exactly where I want to be. Julian looked at her hands. He saw the dried blood flaking off her skin, mixed with the paint. It was the visual manifestation of who she had become, the artist and the survivor. 50,000 a year is an insult, Julian said softly. Nora blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me. For a CFO who takes fire to protect the firm's assets? Julian continued, a faint smirk playing on his pale lips. It's a pathetic valuation. You need a raise. Nora let out a wet, choked laugh. A tear finally escaped, cutting a clean track down her dirty cheek. I don't want a salary, Nora said, leaning closer to him. Her voice was steady, fierce, and entirely devoid of fear. I want equity. I want a seat at the table. I wiped the Barones out of the logistics hub. I hold the cipher to your entire empire, and I saved your life. I am not an employee, Julian. I am a partner. Julian stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the woman who had stood trembling in a warehouse just 3 months ago, entirely replaced by a queen ready to claim her throne. He lifted his free hand, wincing at the pain in his ribs, and cupped the back of her neck, pulling her down. Deal, he whispered against her lips. He kissed her, sealing the contract in blood trust, and a love forged in the darkest corners of the city. The ledger was finally balanced. Nora had been appraised, tested, and pushed to the bleeding edge. And in the end, the man who owned the city realized the truth. She wasn't worthless. She was priceless. For those kept on the edge of their seat, hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who loves a dark, thrilling romance is a must. Nora proved that being underestimated is the ultimate weapon, and Julian learned that true loyalty can't be bought. It has to be earned in blood. Viewers can drop a comment below with their favorite moment from Nora's ultimate transformation from a captive to a Mafia queen. Subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell ensures no one misses another intense, heart-pounding audio drama. Stay tuned for more.